Thank you very much. I want to thank Provost Ono, his advisory committee, and the library staff for organizing this series and for inviting me to speak at this event. And I'm also supposed to give a little blurb about myself. I am the early modern European historian in the history department, and my special topic is the Reformation period. And so it will come as no great surprise to you that the war that I will be talking about occurred some time back in Europe. I'm not referring to World War I or II, which probably immediately come to mind, but about the 30 Years' War, which took place in the first half of the 17th century, from 1618 to 1648, and has gone into history as the first European war. According to a New York Times article earlier this month, entitled "Population Control Marauder Style," the 30 Years' War makes the top 10 list in the percentage category of world population loss for any war ever fought. Begun as a local fight over religious and political control in Bohemia, what is today the Czech Republic, the 30 Years' War eventually drew in almost every country in Europe. Dynastic ambitions on the territorial level were overlaid with a fight over what Europe should look like politically and religiously. Largely fought on German soil, the war was particularly destructive to the German lands and people, although the drain of soldiers from all over Europe was immense. The conflict marked the endpoint of a century and a half of struggle for stability in Europe and was concluded not following a decisive victory on either side, but because of sheer exhaustion and horror over the unprecedented scale of destruction. While considering all this devastation, two significant aspects need to be kept in mind. First, the greatest loss did not come from the battles themselves, but from the repercussions of war, such as forced contributions, inflation, famine, disease, pestilence, plundering, and violence. These effects were more profoundly felt along the path of troop movement than in areas further removed from the army routes. And here you see, this is the area particularly of troop movement from where the Swedish troops first landed in Peenemünde and then going along this diagonal route. This circumstance leads to the second point: the war did not hit every region equally. And here you see a map that shows the distribution of population loss in the various areas. You see once again that the greatest loss was along these routes, with over 50% in these orange, red marked territories. And for example, in the areas in the northwest, Schleswig-Holstein, Bremen, Hamburg, these areas, the loss was very slight. So, for example, a place like Hamburg at the North Sea not only had a very low death toll, but also profited greatly from the war. My own research focuses on several South German regions around Nuremberg and Munich, nowadays all part of Bavaria, which, depending on the area, suffered between 30 and 60% population loss. So how did people deal with a war of such magnitude, length, and severity? Windows into attitudes and behaviors of early modern European society very much depend on extant sources. A good many documents are available to us through the church, partly because the clergy could write, but also because the church encouraged or demanded and then preserved such records. Among them are diary-style chronicles and parish records that throw light on the clergy and the parishioners. One sentiment runs constant throughout these accounts: fear. Fear permeated everything, whether it was anxiety over one's safety and livelihood or over the uncertainty of roads that made travel a terrifying endeavor. To give one example, the Augustinian nuns near Eichstätt, Bavaria, lay in the line of troop movement and in the early 1630s experienced the destruction of their convent. This frightening experience made their prioress, Clara Steiger, and her nuns shrink back in horror at the mere mention of a troop's approach. The continuous attacks wore Clara down and brought her to the brink of what she could endure. Clara experienced anxiety of varying intensity. Certain events almost drove her out of her mind. When the Swedes took Eichstätt in 1633 and then for 10 consecutive days bombarded the castle where the sisters had sought protection and from where they watched the destruction of their cloister, the prioress felt a deadly fright that threatened to overcome her. Quote, "I'm so deeply afraid that I thought I would lose my body and my life, yes, even my sanity, Verstand, since no one knows the outcome of the siege." Evidently more than death itself, Steiger dreaded losing control of her mind. At the end of the war, in March 1648, the enemy entered their territory once again, and the nuns fled anew to the castle. On the way, they witnessed how soldiers broke into their cloister, which they had just finished rebuilding after the last attack. And it must have been excruciating to see their newly rebuilt home threatened anew with destruction. And what about the terror of the 20 sisters who stayed behind to look after the cloister? Having to suffer such fear, the diary suggests, leaves an indelible mark upon one's life, one that was shared by many but could not be communicated. The fear was so visceral because the civilians emerged as the prime targets of this conflict. The war predates the arrival of garrisons and regular pay for soldiers. Instead, armies were stationed among the populace and often were expected to feed off the land and the people. The result was the utter devastation of the countryside and its peasantry. The excesses of brutality are graphically described in many accounts of the war. And I have a few images here of artists of this time period. This is one of a French artist who portrays the various forms of torture that marauders were executing on the population. Here, hanging someone over a fire, and obviously rape was as is still a very important way of getting at the enemy. And here is just the day-to-day violence of people who were trying to flee with their belongings, violence against everyone, especially women, houses burning down. Not everyone managed to endure the terrifying reality of war. A particularly graphic example of the literally overwhelming pressures of war comes from the Brigidine cloister in Altomünster, Bavaria. Most nuns had been able to flee to Munich before the enemy advanced on their cloister in late April 1632, but 2 nuns who had been unable to travel starved to death. When the others returned, they found their market ruined and burned down, even though the flames had spared their cloister. Shortly after their arrival in 1634, the plague hit the cloister and killed 15 sisters. When in early May 1635 the abbess was unable to find food for her charges, she finally snapped and hanged herself. Neither familiarity with nor distance or temporary reprieve from the brutality of war could reduce the panic. The fear of harm could be as debilitating as the harm itself. It could paralyze men and women, and only the most resourceful were able to overcome its poison. Rumors about impending attacks circulated wildly, stirring up fear and panic. It took a realistic mind to assess and react to these reports in an appropriate manner and to keep the paralyzing elements of fear at bay. And indeed, one of the most striking characteristics of people successfully dealing with the war was their keen sense of reality. Making informed judgments about what kind of action a situation required, they glanced often with concern, but sometimes with surprising optimism toward the future. The many losses and the constant fear could not deter Clara Steiger from continuing her work and from being hopeful about what lay ahead. Even though her cloister's horses and other animals were perpetually raided and confiscated, she purchased new livestock whenever possible. Despite the fact that countless supplies were robbed while in transit, she continued to organize shipments. When in early 1634 her cloister was finally entirely destroyed, she surveyed the ruins and began to plan the construction of a new cloister. Some of the sisters moved back in between the ruins to start the spring crop. It is amazing that despite the unbelievable misery, men and women did carry on and tried to apply whatever ingenuity, resources, and courage they could muster to escape the deathly maelstrom of war. People confronted the war on a pragmatic and a psychological level. Modes of behavior depended on a range of factors, chief among them geographic location, gender, social and political networks, and personality. Negotiations constituted a vital strategy to survive the rampage of war, and it was a tactic exploited at every social level. Whether trained professional negotiators hired by civic communities to reduce payments and provisions to armies, or plucky nuns trying to save their convent by offering commanders their preserves, all of them realized the importance of negotiating skills to mitigate their situation. If bargaining did not help, armed resistance and other forms of self-help represented a second way of encountering the violence. Authorities were mostly overwhelmed and under-equipped to protect their subjects. Therefore, the populace had to rely largely on its own initiative and ingenuity to protect itself. This was particularly the case with regard to the peasants, who were the greatest victims of the war. They pooled their resources to provide protection while working the fields and banded together to go after plunderers. More frequently, however, contemporaries opted for flight. Typically, this meant a temporary escape to a presumably safer haven until the danger had passed, rather than permanent immigration. The pastor of one Bavarian village had to flee 10 times from his parsonage. Once the minister escaped the soldiers by hiding in the cesspool. More popular were hideouts in forests. Others took refuge in neighboring castles or abbeys, which became so cramped that people could find standing room only. To put walls between themselves and the plundering troops, many peasants made for nearby cities. One can imagine that staying in these more fortified places was only the lesser of two evils. Rarely were cities equipped to accommodate thousands of peasants, complete with their belongings and farm animals. Some refugees were able to rent a room in a burgher's house, but the rest had to contend with the streets. The almost inevitable result of invasions from the countryside was price increase, hunger, and epidemics. These consequences were palpable in the diary of Hans Heberle, a shoemaker of a village near Ulm, an imperial city in southern Germany, who over a period of 18 years fled 28 times to the city of Ulm. During his third flight, he noted, quote, "There's distress and misery, starvation and death. There we lay on top of each other in great wretchedness. Then price increase and hunger broke in on us. After these, the evil disease, pestilence. Many hundreds of people died during this year, 1634. Heberle lost his second son as well as 3 of his sisters and a brother in this flight. A curious pattern is visible in this moving about. The reshuffling of living arrangements is reflective of society's hierarchy of power, social class, and gender. Nuns moved into the quarters that monks had just vacated on their flight to a safer haven, and peasants made for the city from which the better off citizens had fled. Safety was a relative term in any case, but evidently it could only be attained proportional to one's gender and station in society. How did people deal with the war on a psychological level? Writing down one's experiences was one way of coming to terms with what happened. Placing one's thoughts outside of oneself on paper could alleviate the heavy burden. But authors continuously pushed against the limits of language since some of their experiences could not be put into words. They frequently broke off in the middle of a painful description and declared they were unable to narrate the full extent of the outrage. Words could not convey, nor human understanding grasp the true magnitude of horror and pain. Such utterances reflect both the constraints and the power of language. Writing down the details of an ordeal meant having to endure the suffering all over again. There was then a fine line between easing the burden of one's experience and being overwhelmed by it anew. Many looked toward religion for comfort. One might expect that as a consequence of the continuous agony, people focused on the presumably happier afterlife in their desire to flee this veil of tears. But rarely does one see this escapist trend in the diaries. For most, religion was not an escape, but a consolation and an anchor as the mayhem of war broke out around them. Another way of coping with war was by trying to make sense of it. Knowing why one suffered helped to bear the misery. Frequently, these attempts carried religious connotations. Especially the educated understood the war as God's punishment for human sinful behavior. Here was at least one rationale to explain and understand the reason for their afflictions, which also held out hope for an end of the misery. Sermons and political writings urged contemporaries to mend their ways so that the punishment would cease. Many made sense of the war by casting it as a battle of religions or confessions. One's own religion represented that of the true believers, while the enemies were followers of the devil. Catholics and Protestants respectively boosted their own religious confession and righteousness by denigrating the opponents. In fact, propaganda went a step further by portraying it as a cosmic, apocalyptic struggle between good and evil, between the forces of Christ and Antichrist. Here you see the occupied city of Augsburg, the imperial city of Augsburg in southern Germany, Bavaria, and the animals, the beasts of the apocalypse. It was a means to mark and reinforce one's identity, to provide comfort to followers, and to claim religious, if not necessarily military, victory. In such ways, contemporaries found meaning and comfort as they grappled with the violence of war. But what happens when one can no longer neatly separate enemies and friends? When the purpose behind all this suffering is no longer clearly discernible? What if one could not trust one's own troops? If they plundered your homestead or monastery or village as furiously as the enemy troops did? What indeed if one's own troops were worse than the enemy's? The experience of destruction from one's own friends shattered people's worldview. The sociologist Peter Sloterdijk calls these experiences Störerfahrungen, a term that denotes occurrences, quote, that explode hitherto experiences, convictions, or behaviors that have been taken for granted. How can one make sense of a war if the basic principles with which one understands the world no longer apply? How can one maintain hope if one's own troops have become the enemy and there's no recourse left. From our own experience with war in recent history, we know that it is easier to cope with suffering and sacrifice if the world is clearly divided into good and bad guys, and when we know on what side we are. World War II is a perfect example. Those Americans who sacrificed themselves in their fight against Hitler have gone down in history as indisputable heroes. Those who lost a loved one could find comfort in the fact that he or she died for a worthy cause. What if the lines between good and evil are no longer clearly drawn? If the worth of the cause is debatable, maybe questionable, or difficult to discern? Military conflicts of more recent decades have been less a matter of black and white and have proved more challenging to come to terms with. Looking back at the 17th century, the strategy of demonizing the opponent in religious terms worked fairly well during the early years of the conflict, but the mounting violence and a seemingly unending war also led to a profound questioning of identity. With the build-up of unspeakable atrocities on both sides over 3 decades, religion's content, function, and justification came under review and contributed to the growth of religious skepticism and of more inward-looking forms of religion, such as pietism. After years of negotiations, the 30 Years' War did finally come to an end. And here are a couple of images of the celebrations that mark the peace agreements. This one comes from Antwerp, where civic authorities put on fireworks, which can't quite compete with ours, but this is a nice attempt. And here in Nuremberg, the city council put on a feast, and you see this is a fountain, red white coming out of this one and white wine coming out of that one, and they were feasting on this. The concluding Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was a treaty unprecedented in its scope and became the blueprint for the development of modern international law. Indeed, law, not religion, emerged as the new force that established the principle of equilibrium between the powers of Europe. For the involved political parties, it proclaimed an amnesty that granted an, quote, everlasting forgetting, forgiving, and pardoning of injustices. On the smaller scale, among society up close, forgetting was much harder to achieve.